So let's take a look at some of the angriest Chaos Cultists around, what happens when you take some Corn Worshippers and juice them up full of Stims and World Eaters blood and throw them at the enemy. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where we've been talking World Eaters over the past couple of weeks, and today I thought we'd talk about their brutal cultist Jakhals. Games Workshop seem to have liked making a raised cultist equivalent for the Chaos Legions that have got their own books, and the Jakhals are cultists who are very World Eaters flavour, hyper-violent, and carrying a couple of chainblades. Let's talk through their unit rules and Wargear choices, a little bit about their damage output and any buffs and synergies, and how I think about fielding them in-game. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight in. First up, in terms of what Jakhals actually are, they're basically mortal cultists and hangers-on of the World Eaters Legion, with tanks of stimulants grafted onto their backs, and also in the deadly concoction are 8 drops of World Eaters blood to harness a little bit of power of the Space Marine Legion proper. When they need to, they infuse these tanks into them, giving them more power and raw melee might, but a few of them burn out and die as a result. It's not a concoction really meant for mortals. Games Workshop have released a plastic kit for them. It's £30, €40 or $50 from Games Workshop directly. Kind of low in terms of points that you might put on the table per dollar spent, and it is probably going to get worse with the Warhammer price increase announced in March. I guess you could probably use just about any cultist miniatures, adding in some chainblades to them, and they'd kind of look the part. And I'd also bear in mind that when the World Eaters Combat Patrol releases, there will be a unit of 10 of them in there, so that could be another way of obtaining them a little bit cheaper. I think the miniatures themselves have gone down at least fairly well for cultists. You get 10 of them in a box, and they are fairly dynamic and have a good sense of motion with those dual chainblades. Some nice classic oversized 40k weaponry there. They come with a few wargear options too, like a Mauler chainblade, icon, and a Dishonored with a Skull Smasher. If you were looking to pick them up a bit cheaper, Element Gamers has them in the UK as well. £25.50 currently, so a 15% discount. I'll leave that linked down in the video description below for people in the UK. It is an affiliate link that helps support the channel. Getting into their rules and datasheet though, and Jakhals are a troops choice for the World Eaters, 7 points per model, and you can take 10 to 20 of them within the same squad. Compared with cultist equivalents in a few of the other legions, they actually get some pretty decent rule support. They do get the Blood Tithe, they do get objectives secured, and they get Relentless Rage, the World Eaters Legion trait as well, which actually makes their melee pretty dangerous for the points. The main thing they don't get, of course, though, is core, so it means that a lot of the character buffs just aren't really relevant for them, and it means that they're a unit that you just might not want to build around massively compared with some of the others. The 7 points gets you a stat line of a cultist but with more attacks, a fairly weedy defensive profile. They move 6 inches, have a toughness of 3 and just 1 wound with a 6+ save, so really not hard to kill for 7 points, but their combat power really isn't too bad. They're strength 3 with 3 attacks and only hit on 4s, which isn't a great start, but having the World Eaters keyword they do get that Relentless Rage Legion trait, which means that in reality they're going to be attacking with 4 attacks, strength 4 and AP -1 with their Jackal melee weapons, and that is some serious combat power for just 7 points per model. They will lose a fair bit of their combat power though if they are locked down in melee for multiple turns. Still though, with just that kind of volume of attacks, they're pretty likely to just obliterate most light infantry that you charge them into. It's a fairly serious amount of strength 4 and AP -1 for a very cheap cost. Then for other weapon options, the leader gets an auto pistol, which isn't particularly exciting. But then there's 3 different wargear upgrades that you can get within the unit, a Mauler chainblade for strength +2, AP -2 and damage 2, but -1 to hit. There's a model called a Dishonored within the unit who gets a base strength 4. He's the big hulking muscly guy on the bottom right here. He can take that nice mace type thing called a Skull Smasher. That one gives him a strength user but AP -2 and damage 2 with double attacks, which is some serious combat power. Finally, the unit can take a Jackal icon, plus 5 points for a +1 to combat attrition, and access to that stratagem where you get 3d6 and drop the lowest on the charge. Finally, they do have a special rule regarding their Jackal stims. Once per game, you can cause the unit D3 mortal wounds to give them +1 strength for the rest of that fight phase, basically trading off a bit of damage on the unit for a bit of raw melee power, at least against certain targets. We'll come back to that one in just a second. Overall, I'd rate the Jakhals as a fairly dangerous combat unit for the cost, a nice cheap unit that can sit on objectives with objectives secured, but they really do die very easily for the points cost. 7 points for toughness 3 and a 6+ save just isn't that great. Let's go through them in a little bit more detail though, and first up we have those 3 Wargear choices and which ones I'd be tempted to take. First up, I think you could definitely just argue to just keep them as cheap as possible. 70 points is already a little bit expensive for a unit that might just be doing grunt work and objective scoring. I feel like if World Eaters did have access to 50-point cultists, they'd be quite tempted to take them for that same role. It does mean that any other upgrades and things might just be diluting the main purpose of the unit to be cheap and expendable. However, if you were going to take any upgrades, that Skull Smasher seems like a pretty excellent one for just 5 points. It changed the Dishonored from usually striking with 4 attacks at strength 4 and damage 1 to a pretty crazy 8 attacks at strength 5, AP -2 and damage 2, still hitting on 4s, but that would legitimately outfight quite a lot of character choices within Warhammer 40k. It's absolutely crazy damage output out of a single 12-point model, and just with average rolling that'll usually kill around about 3 light infantry or around 2 space marines just with him alone. Even if you did want to keep the unit cheap, I feel like this is a pretty tempting pickup nonetheless. Even if you only ever got to fight with it once every few games or so, it probably is still going to be worth it for the sheer amount of destruction it can unleash. Just seems very nice that, say, if your opponent charged the Jakhals, killed most of them, and then just the Dishonored survived to strike back, he could still tear a surprising chunk out of the enemy units before they go down. Otherwise, I think that the other two upgrades are kind of a bit underwhelming. The Mauler Chainblade is definitely a lot less good value for the cost, usually 4 attacks at strength 6, AP -2 and damage 2, but hitting on 5s, not 4s. If you want maximal melee damage out of the Jackal unit, it's definitely usable, but for the 5 points it's not a hugely efficient upgrade in my opinion. And for the Jackal icon, I think I'd likely probably leave that. The +1 combat attrition is only going to come into effect when the unit's less than half strength. It just seems a bit underwhelming on a fairly expendable unit in the first place. The stratagem access is good, but if you're also using berserkers with icons, I feel like they're usually going to be the ones that want to use the 3d6 drop the lowest charge stratagem. Overall, for how I'd equip them, I think I'd usually just keep them as a cheap squad, probably just pick up the Skull Smasher and nothing else unless you don't have points for it. With all these attacks, let's talk about how much damage they can actually do in combat. And I must admit, for a 75-point unit with a Skull Smasher, the Jackals unit is really quite impressive against a fair few targets. If an undepleted squad of them did manage to make the charge on the enemy, they'd average something like 13 dead guardsmen, 4 dead space marines, perhaps 1 or 2 dead terminators, 5 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle, and they struggle a bit against a toughness 8 vehicle with -1 damage. Compared with most other World Eaters, they've got slightly lower strength and lower AP, so they are going to be a lot better against killing lighter infantry as opposed to heavier stuff, but they still tear a chunk out of most things. I guess they're perhaps maximally efficient against things like guardsmen and space marines, particularly with that Skull Smasher being extra good against 2 wound infantry. Despite supposedly just being the grunt cultists of the World Eaters, they hit almost similarly hard to the vast majority of the other units. For 75 points, these really are impressive numbers. I did notice though that unless you're against certain targets, the +1 strength boost to kill D3 cultists is usually just not worth using at all. The main issue is that you take the mortal wounds before you get to fight, so you might well be cutting your own damage output by killing your own models before you get to attacking combat. For this unit with the Skull Smasher, it's basically even against toughness 4 units. The damage output that you gain for wounding them on 3s a lot is basically traded off by having less attacks in the first place, plus you actually lose the models, so you lose defense as well, so usually you don't want to do it. I think the numbers only really work out if you're fighting against toughness 5, so the normal strength 4 Jackals go up to strength 5, and the Skull Smasher goes up to strength 6. I think that the numbers of that would usually work out so you're actually killing more enemy than you're losing points in Jackals, but even then it's a little bit on the borderline side. Admittedly, if you did take bigger units of Jackals, say 20 of them, then the buff would get more efficient and it would be worth using against toughness 4 units. However, I feel like most people aren't going to run big 20 strong blobs of Jackals, as one of the main attractions of them is smaller units to do grunt work and objectives and things, plus getting more blood tithe points if they happen to die. Overall, that Jackal Stims rule just seems to be a little bit on the niche side. While we're talking base damage output as well, I thought it might be interesting to compare them against their rivals within the troop section, the Khorne Berserkers. This one's a point-for-point comparison, so it's not just direct numbers. Again, we're using 10 Jackals with the Dishonored using the Skull Smasher on the charge with Relentless Rage against the same unit of Khorne Berserkers with Relentless Rage, and they take that scary damage to Eviscerator. The Khorne Berserkers do cost a fair few more points, so they do more damage overall for one unit, but if you actually weight the points down to be the same as the Jackals, then the numbers are actually remarkably similar. Basically, against the vast majority of these targets, the Khorne Berserkers and the Jackals are kind of even. The Jackals do better against light infantry like Guardsmen, and the Khorne Berserkers do better against Toughness 8. I'd bear in mind as well that the Khorne Berserkers would do a bit better against things like Toughness 5 and Toughness 6. Those brackets tend to be a bit better for them versus the Jakhals. In reality, I suspect that for frontline damage dealers, the Berserkers are going to be the ones that see a lot more play though. They're a little bit less flimsy and aren't just going to be removed by a bunch of bolter shots or something. They do have a few advantages, including being core for some great stratagem access, and that rather cool Blood Surge move, which I think is more useful than the Jackal Stims one. Still though, in terms of raw damage for the points, the Jackals really aren't bad, and they're pretty even with the Khorne Berserkers. Moving on, and the Jackals perhaps have a bit less buffs and synergy compared with most units. They lack core, which does lock them out of most stratagems, and also the ability to get character buffs. I think it's worth mentioning the Blood Tithe though, as this just works particularly well for them. At least in terms of percentage damage increase, the damage boosts actually are probably most efficient on the Jackals over anywhere else in the Codex. Literally all of the damage boosts from the Blood Tithe are perhaps better on the Jackals than anywhere else. The +1 to hit is great on a unit that only hits on 4s normally, usually going to be a 33% damage increase. The same for the exploding 6s to hit. Extra AP is better for them than just about anything else as well, as they've got AP -1, where most of the other battle line units have got AP 2 or better. And the auto wounds on 6s as well, if you do go for that one, is better on the Jackals with their low strength, compared with all the other things which are better strength. Basically, if you do get all of the Blood Tithe benefits going for the Jackals, then for their points cost they are going to be hitting pretty spectacularly hard. In terms of raw damage numbers, if you got all of these Blood Tithe buffs going, the Jackals are usually going to outfight the Khorne Berserkers point for point. The other things are useful enough for them as well. A 6+ Feel No Pain doesn't hurt, but it's maybe less relevant on them than most places. Against damage 1 attacks it's fine, but if the opponent just happens to throw anything damage 2 their way, like heavy bolters, then it's going to be almost irrelevant. The mortal wound protection and the +1 to charges both can be useful as they can across the army. As mentioned, in terms of character buffs, not a lot is going on there due to the lack of core. They can use that Angron's reroll 1s to hit aura that affects non-core things, but I think in reality that's just not really worth thinking about too hard. It's not worth the positioning effort of getting Angron next to your Grunt Cultists. Otherwise though, they do have the keywords needed to ride in World Eaters transports, including rhinos if you'd like to, and I do think that this could be a genuinely reasonable use of them if you did want an unusually cheap objective secured unit in a transport. Most of the World Eaters army lists that I've seen tend to be cramming 2 units of 5 Berserkers into 1 Rhino to make maximal use of the transport capacity. I think that's usually going to be the way to go for the battle line, though perhaps for a single midfield objective snatching squad, a unit of Jackals and a Rhino isn't the worst prospect. 155 points with the Skull Smasher for an objective secured unit to pile out of them. It is a decent amount less investment than a single unit of Berserkers if that was the alternative depending on how you've structured your list. In general, I suspect that more people will be using Berserkers and Rhinos though. You will just be cramming more points and damage into the transport capacity, so it is going to be more valuable for them. Finally, in terms of book stratagems, they only have the access to the one, which is that Icon of Wrath one if you buy in the 5-point icon. This one allows you for 1 CP to charge 3d6, drop the lowest, giving them a better average charge range of around about 8 or 9 inches rather than 7. It's definitely not too bad if you've got an icon and you need to make a long charge. If you are taking these in any sort of bigger numbers and moving them forward, then an icon isn't the worst to unlock this. I feel like it's maybe a little bit wasted though if their main purpose is going to be backfield objective grabbers. Overall, summing them up, here are some of the strengths and weaknesses of Jackals in game. On the positive side, they do have actually good melee for their cost. They're cheap units that can farm Blood Tithe points if they die. They're objective secured troops, which gives them a big advantage on holding points compared with say Spawn or 8-bound. And just being a cheap unit in themselves has lots of other advantages. They can be less wasted doing actions than Berserkers might be, and if you do need a unit to be expendable and say sacrifice themselves to screen or jump on an objective and likely die, then it's better these guys than perhaps things like Berserkers. For downsides, they are slow moving and very fragile for the cost. They're not core, which means they lose some very good stratagems, including the Mortal Wound 1 for 6s to wound, or the Heroic Intervention 1 or Fights on Death. All of those make Berserkers very tempting, I think, and it just means that I feel like you're better off building around a battle line of Berserkers rather than these guys, and these guys are just going to be more auxiliaries. Low leadership also doesn't help them too much. You've got more chance of some of these guys legging it off the board compared with the full-fledged Space Marines. Overall though, I definitely think that they can have a role in a competitive World Eaters list, but with the rules that they have at the moment, I feel like they're unlikely to be the stars of the show and the main battle line of damage dealers for the army. Overall, though, I'd say that that's probably a good place for them. It's always a bit sad when you get Chaos Space Marine armies where the focus seems to be more on the Mortals than the actual Space Marines. I'd guess that not every World Eaters list would use these guys, but those that do would probably be in small numbers. I typically choose to run them myself in 1 or 2 small units of 10, maybe with a Skull Smasher, and their first job in my mind would be to hold home field objectives. A cheaper unit is to do so with a Berserkers. They do have objectives secured, and they can actually have a surprisingly powerful countercharge threat if the enemy gets close. Having perhaps a second squad to move up and go and be an annoying unit on midfield objectives certainly doesn't seem bad either. If you're pushing forward with a bunch of Berserkers and things, they might well get ignored as less dangerous threats. As mentioned before, I feel like you could build out some more models in the unit, and it might be a fun alternative, but I feel by doing so you're probably undermining your main strength in being cheap and expendable rather than a horde of relatively easy to kill bodies that will just die when the enemy shoots them. For the most part, I wouldn't think about supporting them too hard. I feel like they're just there to help out the rest of the army, not be helped by them. I feel like one unit in a Rhino could actually be a fairly interesting midfield objective grabber if you wanted, and if you did happen to be triggering any benefits from the Blood Tithe, then the damage boost would usually help these guys more than most, but perhaps not to the extent where you'd actually change what you picked because of them. My game plan would be for one of these units to sit on a home field objective out of line of sight if possible. They're a cheap unit that could do actions, and they mainly just want to stay safe, and if the enemy does go after the home field objectives, they could be in for a nasty surprise, as these guys can countercharge very hard. For a lot of the cheaper things that your opponent might drop in your backfield, these guys might actually be able to see them off, even dealing with small units of Space Marines fairly handily if they have a Skull Smasher. As mentioned, I usually wouldn't bother too much with the stims. They could be okay fighting toughness 5 enemies and you think the squad's going to get wiped out regardless, but overall the mortal wound trade-off just doesn't seem to be worth it for the damage. Overall, they feel pretty fun and hyper-violent cultists. I'm sure at least a few players will pick them up. I feel like Games Workshop has done kind of well to get them in a role where they can just be a bit of a support piece without stealing the show, and still being far more dangerous in melee than you might expect for mere mortals. Let me know your thoughts on these guys anyway. Would you be tempted to include some in your World Eaters army list, and how would you be tempted to field them? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new things just about every day. Feel free to check out my other videos. I have made a fair few unit reviews for other things within the World Eaters Codex. I'll link my similar overview to the Brutal 8-bound down in the video description. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. You can find that linked down in the video description below also. The channel's Patreon page is what allows me to keep on making videos quite this regularly, and if you are enjoying a lot, any support is massively appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.